No, so, 5, 6 years ago, I'm a guy of ideas. You guys know this. Sometimes I go and actually execute on them. And you would expect my turbo talk here to be about cyber deception, about APT strategies, about different things I've been doing in the past couple of years. But no, I want to go way back to when I had this idea, worked on it, was extremely excited about it, and then had to write it down and give it up, because that's the usual process for me. I did get a non-academic paper done. That's why it was never published. And I also got this presentation going. As you can see, the ancient Word kind of, or open office, I think this was, background, which I kept for the sake of this presentation because I haven't touched this in years, so forgive me for everything. So the name, efficiently managing co-evolution. I have a call now after 3 days of no calls? Never mind. So, efficiently managing co-evolutionary arms races with a potential highly adapted adversary. That was my attempt at really being concise in what I am talking about. But the original name for this talk was essentially fighting superbugs, which I think is cool. So with that, I'm going to, in unscientific terms, talk about 3 things. Number 1 is many conflicts deteriorate into arms races. Can we agree with that? Generally. Put your hands up. Come on, agree with me. Be nice. Anybody not putting their hand up right now? I know where you all live. Okay. Ah, thank you. What? No. Co-evolutionary affect each other, end up in superbugs. That's a major assumption for this talk. And it essentially started where people just started talking about biology and the analogies between biology and what we deal with, and I called bullshit on it many times, and I wanted to actually make sense out of it. And 3, how we can draw conclusions from these co-evolutionary arms races to reflect on handling the conflicts in many fields, i.e. they're cross-platform. So, number 1, they deteriorate into arms races. Number 2, they affect each other, ending up in superbugs. And number 3, it's kind of cross-industry and so on and so forth. So a little bit of background. I'm going to talk about spam. I'm going to talk about botnets. I'm going to talk about terrorism. I'm going to talk about Facebook with very specific case studies. And it's going to be my story, so it doesn't have to be precise. If you have other experiences, tough, but tell me about them. And with that, spam. So this is updated to 6 years ago, right? We've had direct email, then we've had spoofed email, then we've had open relays, then we started using botnets, and more botnets, and we started using more and more techniques. There has been evolution. Terrorism, I'm using, skip there, I think, no. Sorry, I don't remember this presentation as well as I should, right? Botnets, so we started with IRC, then we had private IRC servers, then we had password-protected IRC servers, then we had backup servers with the IRC servers when they were taken down. Then we started having networked servers, i.e. having hub-based environments. We started having, for example, if the defenders got on these servers to collect intelligence, especially identifying nicknames, channels, passwords, we went on to using dynamic DNS. That was huge back in 2004, 5, 6. Dynamic DNS providers suffered tremendously with the IP addresses remaining the same, but you couldn't take down anything around the domain name. Then peer-to-peer networks and fast flux, and that's when I stopped updating this presentation. But there has definitely been evolution. Another example is terrorism. So some people kill terrorists. I'm not going to draw moral or ethical judgments here, but the interesting thing is about the survivors. Those who remain are really, really good terrorists. The dumber terrorists die off. They no longer speak on their cell phones, they no longer do much, and therefore they are now sort of becoming, on the flip side, on the one hand they're superbugs, you can no longer get rid of them, and they are a risk. On the other hand, they're kind of useless bugs, because they don't coordinate, they can't really get much done, and you can, on the other end again, collect less intelligence, prevent less bombings. So it's kind of interesting to watch that trend, as well as how often they forget about these lessons and start over. And another example in terrorism is leaderless resistance, originally written down by a KKK leader and also used by Al-Qaeda, where they don't want to be centralized and be able to be disrupted as a network. Last example I'm going to use, back from way when, is how Facebook spam happened. And it was really cool. It happened over a few weeks to a few months. Has anybody emailed you to let you know your default image is displayed on dynafaces.com? Next up, I think a week later, can you believe I just saw your pictures on cheapfry.com? Then, who has been uploading your images on swimtroll-com-go there? Then, I'm not sure if you know, but your pics are all bake cream, something.com, something, gotta see it. And then they started telling the user, type this, think about this, correct my typo here to be able to go to this spam, and the overall friction for the user to convert was much higher until they changed the tactics again. But it was a tactical case to really look at and learn from. So we detect a trend here, ladies and gentlemen, after about 4 slides, where it's pretty obvious that our strategy in many, many cases is reactive in nature. We see them doing something and we jump on it. Number 2, each action affects the actions after it. And number 3, we reach a situation where it's very, very hard to stop the rival, if at all. So let's be precise about this and start with a question. Why are we reactive? I think we can all have our own pseudo-psychology class and just invent some reasons. I invented mine. Number 1, we start off that way. Fight or flight mechanism, knee-jerk reaction. Something happens, we're not aware that there is strategic situation afoot. It's tactical, we want to get rid of it, we want to be done. Hence, we respond, we're in the game now, it's too late. 2, the cost of changing is too high. Whether it's we don't have resources, we're under constraint, there is a bureaucracy to deal with, this is what we must do right now to maintain our business, our CIA, availability, and all these different buzzwords, whatever it is. And lastly, a strategic solution has not presented itself yet. So we have to do something to stay alive. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we have to do something. So going to the precise nature, the player is not aware of being inside the situation. You respond. You don't think about the long term. The cost from moving from one route you're already on to another one is too high. You don't or can't handle that. You can think of one. And last, which I really believe in and was mentioned by the previous speaker before Steve, is essentially a shortest path to goal or a minimal work unit. What's my shortest path to get to my goal, and that's what I'm going to take. So we see a linear evolution. The more you advance, the harder it becomes, the cost is higher for you to change the path. So with the cost of everything continuing to become high, changing the path leaving you vulnerable, as it takes time and resources from you, and even if essentially a strategic solution is possible at the offset, the very fact that you've done something, it becomes unattainable now. Essentially, it's what's called an evolutionary stable game, and you can Google that. So we now have an arms race. We're done with definitions. We can get into this. And I hope I convinced you that not only do we have an arms race, but it is constant in what we do day to day. In this reactionary is the one word, reaction to reaction warfare, just trying to learn from each other and beat each other up. So, from Wikipedia, a competition between 2 or more parties for the best armed forces, but more relevant and modern definition, the relative goal is staying ahead of the other competitors. So it's co-evolutionary, honestly, if we take this another step forward. A struggle between competing sets of co-evolving genes that develop adaptations and counter-adaptations against each other, resembling an arms race. So far, so good? Awesome. So let's look at the Red Queen, Lewis Carroll. How many of us feel this way when we work in security? It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Frustrating as whole hell. So let's state it a little bit differently. In reference to an evolutionary system, continuing adaptation is needed in order for a species to maintain its relative fitness amongst the systems being co-evolved with. This is starting to get a little out there, but what I'm trying to essentially say is we're constantly reacting in the rat race of security, but we look at it as tactical. constantly. It's not, it's strategic. So let's go back to strategic thinking and wrap this up. We couldn't think of anything. We couldn't think of a viable strategic solution. Hold on, my pens are falling down. I gotta pull them up. Excuse me, please. So we couldn't think of a viable strategic solution. Whether you think about terrorism and peace, spam and economic solutions, there were some interesting examples over the years I will not go into right now. But can we manage our tactical behavior strategically? Meaning, we now know there is a game. Can we actually play with the evolution instead of the evolution playing with us? We acknowledge there is an evolutionary or co-evolutionary process. Let's try to play that. Can we control the next step of the rival? And we have all in our careers done something where we noticed it happening, but it wasn't very much organized. It's a second layer that simply doesn't exist in our thinking right now. So, what do we play for? Specifically, if we believe this is really going to be a superbug, which is the assumption behind this talk, we want to prevent, prolong, or reverse the superbug situation from happening. I'm going to go on a tangent here and talk about Israel for a second. I'm Israeli. This does not represent Israeli politics or current Israeli strategy, but originally, the very essence of the Israeli security strategy was to be the bully. Meaning, the assumption was, and again, I'm really misrepresenting this for the sake of time, but the assumption was, no matter what Israel is going to do, the Arab states are going to attack it. Terrorism wasn't really, it was there, but it wasn't that big of a deal. There is always going to be another war. So the question became, what can Israel do to prolong the window in between wars? And the answer was, be the bully. Do some really unproportional things in order to get your safety or your quiet time to be longer. So adapting that, let's take an illustrative example. This is one of my first aha moments where we started blocking. This was a huge argument on Nanog at the time. Everybody told me don't be the internet's firewall, and I was a little bit of a troll. But when we started blocking port 25 on dynamic IP ranges, so SNTP wouldn't work from just anywhere, what happened? We had consequences to this goal of stopping spam and controlling it from where it comes. Simply put, they started using the user's own SMTP server, SMTP settings for the ISP server. So unintended consequences were the ISPs now, I don't remember which ISP it was, but they had to invest millions in new email infrastructure. So on the one hand, we can now, we could theoretically block based on IP address, as opposed to these being spoofable, but they just used more bots. They owned more users and used more email addresses. This was predictable, but what really happened here from my perspective is we moved the fight to where we could control it on our own servers. The cost was immensely huge, immensely huge. Can you say that? But it was very interesting to watch. Another example I remember of going into this, it was 2006 or something, and a lot of file inclusion attacks were happening. And I noticed there were web server botnets out there that people weren't really talking about at all. So I researched this and noticed that over 80% of all the IP addresses that affected web servers that I could observe came from the same IP addresses. I figured, cool, I can block them. But no, I did not. I preferred to collect intelligence for as long as I can because I knew that the minute I started creating blacklists or blocking these 80% of IP addresses, they're going to start shifting these IP addresses around. So my advantage of intelligence is gone, and I made the first step into a co-evolutionary arms race, which I don't know how to win. These two examples for me were huge in developing this theory, which is not really complete. So let's name this strategy, redirecting the evolution. That's just one example of the port 25 thing. You blocked one route, so they pick another. We want to get essentially the ROI. We want to get the higher ground, and we want to try to predict what that will be. Another one is keeping the rival off balance. An example for this, not knowing what direction to take, which is the next natural thing to think here. For example, when treating AIDS, in many cases, there are a combination of drugs, chemotherapy, and cancer. You try to combine different things in order to achieve a result. Another example is resetting the situation. I have a really good example from Terrorism, but I'm not going to go into it because it's at least 5 minutes of talking. But real superbugs, or not just superbugs in antibiotics, but rather think about crop fields. There were several cases, I remember, back then it was Norway, where the local bugs became very resistant. They stopped spraying for a year. That strain disappeared. The old one came back, resetting the situation. And once again, I'm asking, how long would it take them to, us in various situations or various fields, to forget lessons of the past? And how do we research how groups forget? The only research I've been able to find was actually in transportation, how long it takes for people to forget they saw a cop, and the answer was 3-4 weeks. But not much research has been done. I thought about researching Usenet. Over time, our threads repeated themselves, but I've never done real research into it. Another one is attrition, for example. Let's wear them down, destroy the will to fight. Another one is deception. Not deception I do, but relatively speaking, one of the arguments, I don't want to go into politics, but one of the arguments for Iraq, I'm not saying it's a good enough argument, was as long as we fight over there, they don't come over here. A counter-argument can be made, we fight over there, they have a reason to come over here. I'm not going to get into that, but it's one example of a strategy. Then there is brinksmanship, which is a dangerous game to play, to quote some people. But if we bring them to the brink of superbugs, as we discussed in Terrorism, is the superbug now useless because they can't really mount a terrorism attack, as an example. And of course, there is an example here I'm not going to go deeply into because I want to wrap this up, but Coventry. Anybody ever heard of the story of Coventry? No? So nobody really knows if it's true or not. But there was a story, some people say not, some people say it is. We can't really prove it in history, even though it's World War II and heavily documented, that when we broke, not we, the British broke Enigma, they supposedly knew the Germans were going to attack a city called Coventry, and they did not do anything about it or evacuate the city because that would tip their hand and the intelligence would be gone. And then there is a picture of Churchill visiting the ruins. Now, did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't know. But intelligence, when I go into this research, keeps coming up. Do I use the intelligence over time, if it's even viable to do so with so many players in the game, without burning my sources and so on and so forth? Or do I just kill this pain now? And it can expand from there, but that's something I wanted to not just mention along the way, but actually highlight. And there is an alternative thought. Let's not think about it as superbugs so much, but rather, what if we can reach equilibrium? With crime, not everywhere, not all the time, but with crime, we can go out there and generally be safe, knowing we won't necessarily be mugged, won't necessarily be killed. Can we reach equilibrium in cybersecurity or on the internet? Just as an alternative thought for the supposition to this talk. So the claim, essentially, is that co-evolutionary arms races are not new. We claim we have a new way of handling them better by actually acknowledging they're there and playing that game instead of being a part of being a pawn in that game. And we also claim that this is applicable to many fields. It's cross-platform. And I have examples from an SAT, from the SATs, for example. When people study for the SATs, they learn a lot of tricks, such as put in the value, instead of solving something algebraically, try and put in the value of 0. Try to put in the value of 1 and see what happens so you can reach the right result very quickly. So the board would add something along the lines of, hey, let's make sure they need to put in 2 as well. And it's a never-ending story of now the people who study for the SATs have to study a lot more and try a lot more things that waste their time during the test. On the other hand, is the test's actual strategic goal happening? Who is winning at this stage? I'm not really sure. So other potential realms, just to go through some of them. A classic is some missiles and bombers. really a lot of interesting data over the years in history. Mines and mine detectors, drug wars, APT threat actors in DDoS, which is research I've done a lot based on this concept. I went deeply into these specific subjects. SATs I already spoke of. I guess even if we don't have a full model for this, even if we don't acknowledge the full thing, one thing that's critical is just being aware. The mere knowledge of the existence of these systems ensures that you are not going to react the same way when you see something happening tactically on your networks. You may have to still do it, but at least you're aware of it now and can follow it. You can avoid a conflict from the beginning. You can not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but look at what other people have done in other fields, which can be codified. You can use strategy instead of tactics now in a completely tactical situation. And more importantly, when a new conflict is discovered, you can draw from this. You have an MO to use. In summary, these are the key issues. The superbug will often occur, many times, many of them. We have seen this many, many times. APTs, botnets, spam, terrorism, SATs, it's all over the place. And the leadership of the field moves from side to side constantly. There is a strategic level for handling a purely tactical situation. That is key for me. That is so important for me. These can be handled in many fields, from crop fields to spam, in the same way, using the same types of strategies. But more research is required. This is not a model. This is not complete. But I find that everything I do in security has this sort of enigma that comes back to this. My last research on this has been with Inbar Raz, who is here at the conference at CCC a couple of years ago, where we researched various APTs in the world, but the goal was not to reverse engineer anything or look at network communication, but rather try to figure out what their MO is, what is their methodology. I don't want to talk about kill chain. I don't want to talk about the various stages of the kill chain. I want to know what they're actually using. This group, this country, what is their way of operating? And we discovered a lot of very interesting things based on their OPSEC failures. That's one talk that went specific instead of abstract like this. And with that, I want to thank you for listening. I made some claims here. I'm not really backing most of them up, but I find that this changed the way I look at security tremendously. Thank you very much. Sunil.
So yesterday I was talking about the what versus the where, in terms of where the information goes. One observation that we made is that if your where is able to accept change more frequently, then they are also more likely to be a good suitable candidate for information. They happen to be more secure as well. So one way to look at the evolution of superbugs is if we incentivize or help drive the business to accept change or drive change faster, such that you're always changing one step ahead of the attacker, and then attacker never catches up.
So, in other words, having a culture of change makes us more agile.
That's right.
Okay. Next question. Yes.
Well, not just makes us more agile, it actually makes us more secure.
More secure. Okay. That makes sense.
I have a question / challenge, right?
You know what? I'm going to give you guys a microphone because.
I'll start thinking. So a question / challenge. You mentioned that we should consider the strategic level of resolving something over what's a potentially a tactical solution, right? What I struggle with is that how do you align your duty to a player who is probably tactical? In other words, and I apologize for the crude example, what if Churchill was the member of parliament for Coventry? Would he take a strategic decision against his own self-interest, right? And I think that that's something that we often forget. It's how does the incentive structure for defense fit into this co-evolutionary approach?
I have no idea. I will say it's a completely different subject. Once you're aware of, you have another tool, how you use it and how you apply it is entirely up to you. I will say, this is not about making something tactical strategic, but rather applying strategy where it couldn't be applied before. That's just one thing. There are other questions? Yeah. Oh. Where? Who?
The core assumption of your question is that better? All right. The core assumption of your question is that Churchill's self-interest was only to protect Coventry. He also had a larger self-interest that he had to address, right? Which is what's going on with the entirety of the war, et cetera. Right? So if he was on the ground in Coventry. Okay. Okay, well, maybe, well, yeah. Well, that comes down to a judgment call about whether or not he values perhaps his political career, or there are a lot of factors that lead into that, right? So.
Well, okay, I'll go over to Win, and I think I saw somebody else. Okay. No, I don't need a mic. Yeah, you do need a mic for the video, so.
Oh, the co-evolutionary approach that you're talking about, I'm finding absolutely fascinating, and I didn't hear one word that might have an application to it. Symbiosis. Have you thought about looking at co-evolutionary development from a symbiotic relationship as well?
No, I haven't. I mean, I considered, when I look at various terminologies and realms of reference that could be good, I considered it. I chose to start with one, which was Superbugs. I added another one, which is Equilibrium, but I haven't actually explored it all symbiosis. So it could be very interesting to look at.
Two parts. Are you familiar with like economics, mechanism design, that field?
I figured that if I wait to learn enough about economics and game theory to be able to write this in their language, it will never happen. And that's my answer, essentially.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably a lighter weight thing to do, which is to look at the mechanism design part of it and maybe not put the actual talk in the game theory language, but mechanism design is specifically the part about designing games so that the players make the choices you want them to make. And it sounds like what you want to do is design the game instead of play it. And so it seems like it might be some place to get at least some of the strategies about that.
Okay, thank you. Who else had something? Okay, over there. And one more, and I think we need to move on.
So I think one really important way that I agree with the kind of Superbug analogy, but I think one of the things that we can look at actually is a wider world application of not just economics, but macroeconomics and so on, but also political situations. If you look at countries which have successfully achieved peace, democracy, lower crime rates, better standards of living, as opposed to countries which have high rates of crime, high rates of anarchy, high rates of things, you can try to figure out the differences in motivations in attempted crimes. And I think one of the problems that we have, and the Coventry one is quite a good analogy, is that the problem is we as defenders only look at very, very micro kind of environment which is our own network, and we're only responsible for our own network, and we only care about our own network. So we're Churchill making decision for one city, rather than Churchill making decisions about a larger environment in which we exist, and we might be able to do something altruistic for the rest of the situation. So I think this is one of the things that we can look at is how do crime reduction strategies, because this is a factor of crime as well. But if you exclude nation-state actors, most of the malware, the stuff that we see, the phishing, is all about crime. If we look at crime reduction strategies throughout the world on a macro level, how can we apply that to us as defenders?
Absolutely. I can tell you, for example, that when I was in Estonia in 2007 with Ilar, when we tried to look at policing strategy as opposed to management strategy, as opposed to military strategy, the results were completely different. I'll give you guys one example. There are two use cases I really like. One of them was the president's website was under attack. The president's website has maybe 20 visitors a week. Okay, the banks are under attack. What are you going to protect? You have 2 people to use. So the answer seems pretty straightforward. Go and protect the banks. And that might be the right solution militarily. It might be the right solution in management. But what's going to happen is, yeah, on video, so F those guys, we won, let's attack more. So policing strategy-wise, not going into details, we lost. That said, or have we? That said, another example is there was a case of the Estonian parliament's mail server. Mail in Estonia back then was actually used by members of parliament, unlike other places around the world. And when the mail server was under attack, they drew a line in the sand and said, that's it. We're going to keep bringing it up. So they bring it back up. The attackers say, what? How dare you? And they bring it back down. And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until essentially, they say, let's just keep it up and move on to the banks, move on to something else. So various types of looking at this, various types of games and strategies led to completely different conclusions in retrospect. So these are 2 use cases I really like, and policing strategies are really amazing. I will say that for me, I came from a completely technical background, and what was really crucial was that I saw us responding to protect our networks, and essentially we knew, whether we were strategic thinkers or not, we knew this is going to bite us in the ass. But we have to protect our networks and deal with the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and it's kind of a status quo of being frustrated and defeatist in security, knowing they're going to succeed. And in a way, knowing me in this room, this is one of the things that led my thinking over the years to cyber deception and why I'm doing what I'm doing now, to change this sort of equilibrium with my startup. But, status quo. But I will say that just as security people, we often diss the policy level people, we often diss the strategy level people, we diss management, we diss security strategy because it's not very rigorous. As technical people, we come and say, you know what? That sounds like yak, whatever. Talk to me in bits and bytes. And being able to bring the understanding of what we do to a higher level, bring the higher level to a level of rigor that we can use, is one of the reasons this conference is here. And this is one of the places we start. So we had one more question and we're done. Who was the guy? We have 2 more, so let's try and keep them short and move on.
Mine's just more of a suggestion since I like how you think, so hopefully I'll be short. But one thing I've been looking to as well, and it's a little different than the military or more of the attack side, is also looking at InfoSec as like a public good. If you think about environmental concerns, things like that, it's that, for example, with the recent Mirai botnet, you have public libraries, whatever else. It's thinking about when you have something where it's affecting a lot of people, but it's also up to a lot of different vendors and constituents in order to make it more secure. How do you actually coordinate those efforts and make sure that it doesn't fall apart, which I think is another interesting angle to it. I don't have any answers, but you're smart, so maybe you can think about it.
And that's the difference in discussion, saying we want to protect the internet as opposed to we want to protect a specific organization. And lastly, before I give it back to April,
a lot of us have been struggling with this tactical thing because we all know that we're winning most of the battles and we're losing the war. And it's this exact thing of escalation. And I don't know the answer. I think a lot of us don't have the answer, otherwise we wouldn't be debating this. But we have to keep in mind, things like, you can call the Vietnam War, where the Americans went in, a war, police action, whatever you want to call it, but the Americans won almost every battle and they still got kicked out of the country. And so we don't want to get to that place, but we're heading there. And so we have to keep that in mind.
All right, thank you very much for listening. Now, before we go to lunch, we are going to do two things. Number one, we're going to present one model we already worked on to try and create the sort of, it's again, bad analogy, RFC1. If we create a model, how do we discuss it? We have had some work done on this already. This will be one of the corners of the room. And then April is going to send you to talk about your subjects and come back. And then we're going to do lunch. April, anything? Or just give it over to... Yeah, okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Steve and Joel. They're going to talk for a few minutes with the work we've already done on one of the models, the model to rule them all. So this is a new talk.